Anytime.
Good morning, everyone. This is the Vermont House Committee on Commerce and Economic Development. It is Tuesday, April 14th, 2026 at 9:05 in the morning. So we're beginning our week and our day to look at S313, again, which is an act relating to transforming Vermont's career technical education system. And we have members from Joint Fiscal Office joining us. I know that there's a study that's ongoing, and so Julia, thank you for joining us. Appreciate your time, and if you can give an update to the committee of where we are, how things are going. Yeah.
Sure, absolutely. Good morning, Julia Victor, Joint Fiscal Office. I think this is my first time in this committee, at least this session. So it's great to see you all. You don't see me very much because I work in education and finance. So I spend a lot more time in the education committee and House Ways and Means.
Sure.
And we're here today to talk about CTE, which I know you've been doing a ton of work on. So to the chair's point, I thought it would be helpful to just sort of take a step back, think about Act 73 and CTE, and then talk about an ongoing contract that JFO has that relates to CTE work as it would fit into the new finance formula. So as you all likely recall, with the passage of Act 73 last year, it set the ball rolling in terms of a lot of work. And as you all know, there's a lot of outstanding work that still needs to be sorted out for a new education financing scheme to take effect. And one of those pieces, among others, is CTE. And so before going into our specific contract and scope of work, what we're working on, I think it's really important to note that how CTE fits into the new education financing system, whether it's a weight, whether it's included in the base, whether it's categorical aid, those are all policy decisions that will need to be made in terms of how CTE both fits into the structure, like what is the actual funding mechanism, and also what are the funding amounts? Is it the same amount? Is it varied amounts? And that was not determined, of course, last year, and that's what we're all grappling with it now. So to that end, as part of Act 73 last year, and I can pull up, I heard that you're a sharing committee, so I'll go ahead and share my screen. Part of Act 73 last year included this section 45A, which required the Joint Fiscal Office to contract with one or more contractors to review and recommend a whole host of issues related to the education financing structure that hadn't yet been sorted out or that there were different opinions on. So the legislature said, you know, here are a few issues that we really want a contractor, an expert, to come back and make recommendations to us all on. And that was included in section 45A. And this is actually one of the contingencies in Act 73 for all of these pieces to take effect, that the General Assembly must have received this report. And that still is included in H 955, which I know you're talking about this week. But for this committee in particular, I want to highlight this sub 3, which this is the scope of work of the contractors, which is how to account for the provision of career and tech ed in Vermont's financing formula. So to that end, we went out, shall I just keep going? It says, okay. To that end, we went out to bid, put out an RFP this summer, fall, ended up finding the full scope of work to a contractor, American Institutes for Research, AIR, and they are now undertaking this work. And this report is due back to the General Assembly in December of 2026. So this coming December. And with respect to that, I'm happy to walk through the whole scope of work if that's of interest, but I'll start on task 5 because it's the most relevant to S313 in your committee's discussion in terms of the scope of work. So to my earlier comments about how CTE fits into the financing formula, whether it is a weight, part of the base, categorical aid, and also those funding amounts, that is a policy choice that you all will need to make. And so as part of the scope of work, the contractor is required to recommend how to account for CTE in the funding formula. We included this more specific provision that the consultant will clearly describe how they would recommend CTE to be included with the funding formula, including recommended financing streams, tuition, categorical aid that could also be within the base, that could be a weight, as well as recommended funding amount or amounts. Perhaps the consultant will come back and say, you know, we recommend a single amount regardless of program, or perhaps they'll say, we recommend multiple amounts.
Yeah, this might be premature, so tell me to be quiet if it is. I mean, it's interesting. We got probably a contract, and they're going to go out and collect all the data, and they're going to make some recommendations. It sounds like some of those recommendations, of course, are policy kind of issues. Right? So I'm curious about how they're going to. I mean, are they going to be making recommendations about choices? You know, tuition categorical aid is, you know, a big difference, right? So are they going to be recommending one or the other, or are they going to give us some understanding of how each policy choice would work?
Yeah, I don't want to speak for the contractor. I
Okay.
will say that they are charged with making recommendations.
Right.
So, of course, that is different than JFO's scope of work where we are nonpartisan.
Right.
And we don't make recommendations. So I would say it's fair to assume that the contractor will come back and say, you know, here are some serious advantages of choosing this funding stream over that funding stream.
Yeah.
And from our expert opinion, we would recommend doing A, or we would say, we would recommend doing A, B, or C, depending on what your policy goals are. And I think that we don't really know where they'll land until they do a lot of the work that they haven't done yet. So that's really the last part of this is like, we're still very much in the early days of this contract.
Sure.
Where they're going to end up, we have no idea yet.
Yeah, I'm just thinking that from our perspective, you know, looking at some of these issues and some of the policy choices, and you know, we may have a thought about what sort of direction might be going, but it sounds like they're kind of off on their own in terms of expert taking a look at things, making recommendations.
Yeah, I would say that. And I would also say that's really what Act 73 asked for, is that Act 73 required JFO to contract with a consultant or consultants to make recommendations about a number of these topics, CTE
Okay.
being one of them.
Okay.
And I would say to that end, that was the legislative charge. That's the scope of work we agreed on per the language. And it's a report, bless you. So if the contractor comes back and says, you know, here's what we recommend, and the General Assembly says, no way, then it's a report. And it lives in a report. It's in no way, I'm not a lawyer.
Yeah, yeah.
No, in no way binding.
No, of course. I'm just not sure where we are there at that point. And yes, fine, thank you.
So that's really that's the scope of work. That's the update on the contractor. And I guess that's really all I'm prepared to say about the scope of work, unless there's additional insight that would be helpful.
How confident is JFO that the consultant can work within the time frame and come up with the recommendations that are requested?
I would say so far we're looking really good. The Agency of Education has really worked well to provide a lot of the data. So a lot of the initial data requests, actually, I think all of them at this point have been filled. So to the extent that there's no unforeseen hangups, which there very well could be, But to the extent that things continue to progress as we're expecting them to progress, I think next December is definitely feasible. That said, if there was legislative action that was charging JFO with doing additional work or trying to amend this contract, then I think it would be a different kind of question if we could, if they could still get a report back to the General Assembly by December.
So it's safe to say that currently we have no idea what any cost would be. If we're looking at Anessa, we have no clue of what that would cost us. And for number one, implementation, number two, down the road, we don't know that yet.
Yeah, and I would say I will admit, I haven't followed all of the committee discussions on S313 because I've been busy elsewhere.
Yeah.
And to that end, there have been a number of CTE studies, as the committee is probably aware, over the years, looking at Vermont's CTE landscape. There was the studies done by APA. The work being done by AIR is really trying to build on the work that has been done thus far and further get into the questions of like, okay, this information has been collected. There's still a lot of outstanding questions to your point. How can we actually cost out how CTE should fit within the financing structure?
I have two questions. One of them is, we have 4 governance structures for CTE today. I'm assuming that the contractor is aware of them. And
Yes.
Okay. And then one of the things that we keep talking about is getting technical education to the younger people and also to adults, which is not funded in this way. The adult pieces, the younger, right, the middle school is. Are they looking at any of that and all that needs?
I'm glad that you asked that. The adult component, I don't know. We have a standing weekly meeting with them. I'll actually be meeting with them tomorrow to talk about the CTE component. So this is a very well-timed committee meeting, so I will bring that up and ask about that. I will say that we've already been talking about sort of the pre-tech programs and how that could fit into their work. So they're aware of it, they're talking about it, and they're working now to figure out how that could fit into their underlying modeling.
And I guess there are a couple of pre-techs, right? There's the middle school pre-tech that some districts have and many do not. And there's also the pre-tech for 9th and 10th graders.
Yeah,
That has been given a little bit of a, it's a little less clear for the tech centers today, whether they can offer them whether students can take them more than once instead of once and done. So there's new information. So I guess the landscape keeps changing today. And so I'm just, that's really hard for somebody to take what we're doing now when what we're doing now was one thing when they started doing the work. Yeah, okay.
absolutely. And I think that that's one of the challenges of
All the education.
the whole study. Because it's like, we're looking at this new education finance system that's currently being reworked and rebuilt in so many different areas. And so one of the reasons actually that JFO decided to award the entire scope of work to one contractor rather than splitting the scope of work among a number of contractors was so that to the extent the contractor could say, okay, here's the foundation formula that we're recommending, and here's the CTE amount that we're recommending, and here's how they should fit together. And if you're doing this district configuration, here's how that should fit with the CTE piece and the foundation formula piece. they're already working and thinking about how they can fit all of those pieces together. So it's certainly a challenge. And I think it's a challenge that if they can't fully address it in the report, they'll be able to address why. It's a challenge and sort of next steps that would be needed in order to better understand how to cost it out and include it.
So in 313, we're changing the definition of comprehensive high school into a fully integrated, so that budget wise, there's no CTE budget, there's no education, there's one budget.
Mhm.
And so will this report take that into consideration as well?
I think, assuming that that is what passes the General Assembly, I would say yes. And one of the reasons that we are, meeting with the contractor regularly is to tell them, like, here's how the conversations are developing. Here's the directions that the General Assembly may be moving. And so I think that the significant pieces of legislation that passed this year that would impact the direction of the future financing formula will be taken into account.
Because there very well, I mean, there very well could be two different funding systems that have to be going on at the same time. One, if we have these regional comprehensive integrated schools, and at the same time, we still may have some of the same structure that we have now, depending on
Time.
well, depending on how we decide what the bridge will be, what kind of system, one governance system. And then it very well could be going on for a long time, having to have two systems, and it may be forever, because we may not be able to do regional integrated comprehensive schools all around the state. We may still need to have some of the system that we have now. We don't, but I mean, the goal is to get there, but we may not be able to get there depending on the size of the districts or whatever we're going to call us.
I was going to say something like that, and it sounds to me that, our work on 313 might be very helpful for you and the contractor in terms of talking about what policy choices we need more information and help from them, so they can try to integrate it in their work. So we don't get, caught in December or January with something that seemed to be pretty important, but we don't have the data goods to really deal with it.
Yeah, I think, I guess the one piece I would say is we can only pivot within the scope of work so much before amending it.
Yeah.
And so to the extent that, and I don't think this is the case with S313 as currently drafted, and to the extent that something comes up and it's really different than what's been contemplated thus far, then we would need to revisit with the contractors. Do we need to open up the scope of work, push back the timeline, so on and so forth? But we're not in any way at that point.
One other issue, which isn't as big, and we think we have a spot in the appropriations bill to deal with issues around transportation. There are some CTEs that have waiting lists and some CTEs that have vacancies, and I think
It's
suggesting
955.
it's in 955 itself. Okay, so I would just mention that as an issue, maybe to flag with you folks. So I think we're trying to have a piece in 955 that deals with this issue that might be relevant to their work.
Yeah, I would say we've been working very hard on 955. Little plug, we just published our fiscal note, so check it out if you want more information. And yes, part of H 955 does include a report and the agency a deep look into transportation. So I would say everything that's included in these education bills that are being worked on, because we are also working on them.
Sure.
We're very aware of what's in them. Thank you.
Other questions for Julia? Julia, thank you for coming.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess, I don't know if you're gonna pull up Ezra, if Ezra's gonna come up.
Yeah, just. You have more, do you want to share with the committee, Ezra?
Sure, I guess I could share it either from here or from over there.
Come over here,
All right, great.
thank you.
Yeah. Oh, for the record, Ezra Holden, Joint Fiscal Office. I guess the only thing that I came to kind of give to y'all is my own little plug. I didn't want to send it ahead of time so we could keep the conversation focused on the scope of work that Julia brought, but I did work on a CTE issue brief over the summer, and it talks a little bit about the governance and funding and some considerations with Act 73. So if that's helpful, I can send that to Matt and he can share that link with the committee. I see right now, as you have it drafted, S 313 does have a governance legislative study group, so that might be something to give you all a few considerations to think about while considering that work. And that's all I really have to share.
Great. Maybe, we'll take a look at that, maybe,
Might be good to have a little bit more of an
Yeah.
overview while you're here, is that?
would you be able to pull it up on the screen and go over some of that with us?
Sure, yeah, that's helpful.
Otherwise, we'll have to invite you back in again to walk us through your thoughts and.
Sure, would you like me to share the link right now or just do that at the end of?
I think you can share the link with Matt now, and then he can pull it up and put it on our webpage, but also share your screen as well.
Sure. Matt, can you send me a Zoom link? I'm not sure I have one. Thank you. All right, thinking about it. All right, there we go. Is that a comfortable viewing size for everyone?
Oh, don't make it small.
Oh. All right, so would you like me to just kind of run through the whole thing with you, or is
Yeah, I
there
think that'd be great. Thank you.
kind of a walkthrough? Sure, all right, so essentially, Act 73, which I'm sure you all are familiar with, 2025, the big education transformation bill. So that made significant changes to Vermont's education system, but as I'm sure you all are aware, it left a few areas such as CTE, a little bit teacher legislative work. And so this brief is in one sense, it's a little bit of an overview of the whole CTE system in Vermont, a little very high level background. But on the other hand, we have some considerations on a few specific Act 73 areas that align with CTE or don't align with CTE and maybe could use some legislative work, which is why I guess I think you have a working group in S313. So as I'm sure you all are aware, CTE offers students a way to gain some experience in fields while they're still in high school. Or if they choose to go to post-secondary, it allows them to kind of get a sense of what interests them. So the total in-state enrollment for fiscal year 2024 was about 2,500 full-time equivalent students. And this might be repeat information to you all, but when we're talking about CTE, full-time equivalent students is the count that is used to drive the funding. And so that is your 6-semester average of students to get a full-time equivalent.
When you were looking at that, did you, how many students we send to other states for CTE? Or did you note how many students were on the wait list for CTE?
So I was not able to access a unified set of waitlist information, but we did. I'm glad you asked. I did look into that. Let's see, it's in the enrollment section here. So looks like we had about so I found about 41 FTEs that were Vermont students attending CT outside of Vermont. So that was what I was able to find.
Great, thank you.
But yeah, I did try and find some information on waitlists and just wasn't able to find a single unified list from the agency at the time. So
Okay,
I thought we had some guys.
Perkins, all the Perkins should have it, I think. All the Perkins.
I've never seen a chart of, you know, these ones had wait lists and these ones had.
But if
capacity.
if the agency didn't provide it to Ezra, then good.
Yeah, I know. No, I totally understand. I think it's there somewhere in AOE land.
yeah, well, we can take a look at that. That would be helpful.
It may even be on our website. Because they can bring the documents.
Yeah, I did catch some of that testimony, so I can follow up if that would be helpful. Or
Yeah, I think would be interesting for us to know, we know that there's 2,500 students that go through the system. But we don't know what the backlog is. How many more students could we actually be putting through the system?
And I would just like to note that that is full-time equivalent. So in actual unique students, it's actually a little over 5,000 who participate in
Because of the
CTE.
halftime.
Yeah, because of halftime, because it's an average over the 6 semesters, so it's a rolling average versus, you know, a yearly count of, okay, in this year we had this many students participating. So just a little bit, 2 different ways of measuring students. So that's why you do have some folks will say, well, we have 5,000 students, which is true, but full-time equivalent is what is used for driving tuition to the centers. So to kind of give folks a sense of the current state of CTE, put together this table of kind of the 4 different governance models that currently exist. I understand that some people might think of comprehensive high school as not really a 4th distinct model. However, since it is different from what the others are doing, I thought it would be helpful to include it here. So you have what we're calling the host model, which is the most used form of CT, so that is where you would have a high school like the Burlington High School, and you would have the tech center as part of Burlington High School. And then you would have kids from Burlington, but also other high schools in the region sending their students to that tech center. So we have about 11 of those, and you can see that they educate the majority of CTE students in Vermont. You also have the Regional Technical Center School District high schools, so those are more of a standalone school district, which is focused on CTE. We have about 4 of those in the state. Then the independent models would be the 2 academies, so I believe that would be Linden and St. Johnsbury, who have CTE as part of their high school on campus. And then the 2 comprehensive high schools would be Canaan and Mississaquoi. And they, again, you'll hear different things about them because again, they're not full-blown CT centers necessarily, but they do offer some career and tech classes. So I think it's helpful to just think about those. And I believe S313 includes some language that would allow these to remain comprehensive. So just to go through high level, the CTE Center programming, we go through this to just kind of highlight that programming decisions are made at a local level at the CTE Center, and there are different stakeholder groups at the center that do help them make those decisions. So you have, of course, the Agency of Education has some guidelines, but then you also have the program advisory committees at the centers, which are helping to make those decisions on what program should be offered and how they should be offered within those guidelines. You also have the Perkins funding, so that has some guidelines attached to it as well, which helps drive what programs are offered and how the centers run. We do touch on pre-tech here, and essentially it's not offered in a uniform fashion. So we found that about 17 of the 19 CT centers, and again, that's including comprehensive high schools, which again, I know that some people say that's a center, some people say it's not a center, but we decided to include them when looking at the pre-tech. So 17 of the 19 centers from the data we were provided by the agency offered some sort of either pre-tech program, but they don't all offer the same programs, and the amount of programs that they offer will be in each center. So it's a little bit of a grab bag of what's offered and where it's offered. We did find that the majority of students who participate in those pre-tech programs come from the high school. So for example, to use Burlington, most of the kids in those pre-tech programs are from Burlington. So it's a little bit of a, I guess if you're interested in the educational opportunities, students at the center have more opportunities than students who are in the same region, but they are not at that high school, is something that we were finding in the data. So with CT Center funding, since we have a study, as you heard about, we did not look into trying to make any sort of recommendations or anything like that. That's not really JFO's position, but we just did a high level overview of the funding. So about 60%, a little more than 60% of CTE revenues are from tuition. So that would be your in-state students and also your out-of-state students. We found about 180 or so out-of-state FTEs who come into Vermont, and so they would pay tuition into the Vermont CT centers. And so that brings us to the 2 different tuition rates. So you have out-of-state tuition and in-state tuition. So the big difference between the 2, other than obviously 2 different types of students are paying, but the in-state tuition that can be reduced by the state's tuition reduction program, and that's something that is available for in-state tuition students and not the out-of-state tuition students. And so I think, a footnote here that for fiscal year 2024, this in-state tuition reduction grant was about $4,400 per FTE student. So that would reduce the tuition that their sending school would have to send to the center.
Sure.
Yeah, so this is great answer. Maybe for your benefit at least some of the folks, we have discussions around these kinds of things and funding. A lot of the testimony we've had focuses on the funding system and the extent to which, the tuition payments tend to provoke, dysfunction between the sending schools and the CTE centers. They're sort of competing for money, right? So I just kind of want to let you know, aware of that we're having, I'm not speaking to the committee, but, we've had that sort of testimony, so that might be relevant, as you're thinking about where we're going in this kind of thing, that some folks are not happy with the tuition system.
Mhm.
How that would be done in terms of foundation formula or where it would come from, being another issue, but I think at least for personally, I think it's an important issue.
Yeah, that's good context. And, I think to Julia's point, the benefit of having a subject matter expert doing this study for us, that we are able to look at the current system with all that data and then make their recommendations to how the CT should be funded in the future. Should it be tuition? Should it be categorical aid? Should it be a weight? So I think that's.
A weight in fact, yeah. So yeah, those are, I guess, is the
Yeah, so I think
general categories.
I think the study will be helpful for that.
Yep.
So overall, about 87% of CT revenues come from Vermont statewide education funds. So there are monies outside of tuition, but the tuition payments really are the majority of how centers receive their funding. And of course, there are federal funds as well, the Perkins grant. And then just to touch on some recent trends in CT enrollment, we only looked back a few years because there's COVID and everything, and so didn't want to get caught up in that. But so like I mentioned, fiscal year 2024, the CTE full-time equivalent for in-state students was about 2,500 there, which is approximately 4% decline compared to fiscal year 2017. And so we do have COVID in the middle there, so that's why I kind of wanted to look at fiscal year 2017 and try and draw that line there, but you do have COVID in the middle, so that's just something to be aware of. But like we discussed at the beginning, you also have the actual enrollments, unique students, not just full-time equivalent. So for school year 2025, that was a little over 5,000 unique students participating in CTE. And so that's a little over 20% of your 9th through 12th grade students in the state. So it's a sizable chunk of that cohort. In-state students, we saw that it's been increasing by a little bit there. So approximately 7% of students in fiscal year 2024 were out-of-state students coming here to participate in CTE. I will note that that's a 2-semester average. Out-of-state students, their FTE is a little different from the in-state FTE. So that's a 2-semester average. And that's just for fiscal year 24. The number fluctuates a little bit every year. So that's just something to be aware of.
Are those students primarily at our private schools, students who are, who come to Vermont for high school, or are they primarily border region coming in from New Hampshire or New York? I didn't think we had very many students coming in from other states.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't recall the name of the center off the top of my head, but I do know that we have a public center that has well over 40% of its students are out-of-state students. And I believe that Canaan also has a fair number of New Hampshire students, some of which I believe do actually attend high school at Canaan and are also CT students. But I believe you have some who don't go to high school at Canaan, but may cross that border for the CT. So I know that is some of it. If you wanted, I could come back with a breakdown. I have that on a different table, not in this.
If you
document.
have it and you could send it, that would be great.
Yeah, I can follow up.
Thank you. just to understand those numbers better, are we drawing kids for any reason other than proximity, right? Or are we, and what does that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. I can follow up. If. Yeah, no, I'm not even gonna try and
No.
guess which one it is, so I'll just follow up for you. But yeah, so the percentage of out-of-state students, it's a really wide variance. You can either have 0% of your students coming from out of state, or like I said, a little over 40% of your students are out of state. And so that's a consideration that we flag later on here in this consideration for legislators, is that depending on what is done with tuition, how that could impact centers that rely on out-of-state tuition, or does out-of-state get put in its own bucket separate from the in-state? You know, that's something to think about. Because if you do have a center where, again, 40% or so of their kids bringing in tuition dollars, that's a different situation than like Burlington or Central Vermont or Essex, just, you know, to name any other center with a different profile. So just to kind of go through big picture considerations. So for governance structures, Act 73 does have intent language around CTE governance and wanting that to be more reflective of the state's new larger school districts. That's just from Act 73's intent language. You know, that's not JFO's comment on if that should or shouldn't happen. Just pulled that from Act 73. So just wanted to highlight that the different centers all have different governance and leadership structures. They also have different staffing structures. The 4 standalone CT centers have, you know, they have to do a little bit more in-house versus a center that's just attached to Burlington High School, and it is effectively part of Burlington High School with their director just managing the building, and how having 2 different governance structures could lead to different costs and leadership decisions, which depending on what's done from like the JFO study, Act 73's funding change, that's something to think about how that would really work. Considerations for programming. Just wanted to highlight here that many centers offer some programs, but not every center offers same program. So for example, we found that around 16 of the centers had some sort of construction program, but we could only find 6 dedicated electrician programs. Similarly, you could have a majority of centers with some sort of healthcare or health service program, but then you only had 4 with EMT programs. So just highlighting. And some centers might have an EMT overview wrapped into their health service, but it's not necessarily a full dedicated program. And this is just a highlight that the centers all have different programs. And so in a more consolidated system where funding is maybe more streamlined and not just charge a different tuition rate, that could be something to consider, that one of the centers with different offerings, should they be more similar? Should they not be more similar? You know, that's just something to flag. And then finally, considerations around funding. We've touched on this. Act 73 foundation formula. Big picture gives you a base amount of funding. And if your students meet the student characteristic weights, you can get additional funding. If a school within your district meets the criteria for a support grant, you get additional funding for that. That's different from the current system where a district has a budget, its voters approve the budget, they have their budget. With CTE, as it is currently funded, they have a tuition rate, and so they are able to, they being the school district, can look at where their students are going, the tuition that they need to pay, and they can raise and make sure their budget fills that need. If you're in a system where you're only able to raise very limited amount of funding, that means that that district needs to make decisions. If you still have the same funding structure you do now, how will you pay for that tuition for those students and do everything else if you can't just go and automatically raise all the money? Act 73 does have some ability to raise a limited amount of funds, but it's not the same as current law. So that's something to flag. You do you've heard JFO has a contractor who will be coming back with recommendations, so I think this is an area to kind of be pinning that report when you're thinking about the considerations for funding. And a few other things that may or may not be within the recommendation is there are a few different differences in student counting. So we have 6 semester FTEs for the CTE students, but the foundation formula is based on long-term membership, which is 2-year average. So you have 2 different counts to try and put together the funding. Different governance structures, different centers have different staffing levels. And again, thinking about, well, if you have a more uniform amount of funding statewide, how does that work with centers that charge pretty different amounts of tuition? Because the centers charge the tuition to cover their costs. And so that's something where it could be a little more difficult than current law if you have funding that's become uniform on one hand, but the expenditures are not uniform on the other hand. And then finally, just thinking about the programming choices, how that may or may not be impacting costs, talk a little bit about how centers don't offer the same programs and whether that could or could not be driving some of the cost differences across those centers, which shows up as the differences in their tuition rates. So that's my big picture walkthrough. I think there's a lot that I skipped over, and yeah, I've sent it out to Matt, so you all should have access to it. I did link a few previous reports that were really helpful when I was getting up to speed on CT coming into this. And so linked in there for you all as well.
Any other questions for us? Ezra, did you look into how much money WIOA actually contributes to CTE? I don't think it's a lot, but
I'm sorry, how much?
WIOA funds,
I don't,
Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act,
Off the top.
private labor.
off the top of my head, I don't.
I think it's available for some students, but
I can follow up with that section.
we Jay Ramsey can. Look out with that. Okay. Thank you both. Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Ezra. Appreciate you coming in to fill us in on where we're at this point. Committee, we have for after before we had caucus of the whole on 9:55, the education bill, regular caucus to lunch. Hopefully, we're back in here by 1. We're gonna start looking, talking more about S327 in the context of this afternoon's discussion. It's context of S139, which is CPACE, which was on the show. The 138, yeah, one of those.
What's that?
CPACE, it's a. it
We'll
came
hear
out
all
of-
about
yeah,
it.
We'll hear all about it, came out of energy.
Never heard.
Technology, Friday.
That's fine. I can
8-0 on
be
vote.
patient.
Straw poll vote, but we have agreed to put that
That's
into our economic development bill.
Yeah.
But it's a funding
That's fine.
mechanism for commercial properties, so.
Okay.
We'll hear all about that this afternoon.
There are some documents about it in yesterday's document.
Yeah, I'm gonna ask them
On
all
our
to get
website.
moved to today.
Oh,
That's.
Okay.
Bill.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we're good to go off live and we're back in here